And now on your screen is Professor Chandra Manning, who is the author of this book, What This Cruel War Was Over, Soldiers, Slavery, and the Civil War. Professor Manning, what was your approach to this book?
The first thing to say about approach is that you give me way too much credit when you say approach. The book is not at all the book I thought I was going to write when I started. I started with an interest in Civil War soldiers and a desire to read their mail, but absolutely no intention at all of writing about soldiers and slavery. None. Because I didn't think they would talk about it. I was interested in enlisted soldiers. I was enlisted in the regular farmers and the shopkeepers and the non-slaveholders and the northern grain growers, who I really didn't think were going to care about slavery very much at all. And I was interested in their war, and I was especially interested in how they differed from each other, not just North and South, but how is somebody from Boston different from somebody from Ohio, or how is somebody from the Chesapeake different or similar to somebody from Appalachia. So I was really interested in what people who lived in the 19th century thought about how where they lived connected to this thing called the nation. What did it mean to be an American if you were from different parts of the nation? And so my plan was to do that, to look at how these guys talk about America. How do they talk about the United States? How do they talk about the Union? How do they talk about the Confederacy? How do they talk about the South? Hoping that they would do it substantially different from each other, and voila, I would have something to say. So I headed off into the archives, 45 of them.
First of all, what archives?
Oh, I visited archives from every state that fought in the Civil War. So there are 45 archives represented in this book. Some of them are the huge ones that immediately come to mind, the Library of Congress or Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, which has an enormous Army history collection, but also smaller libraries, state historical associations, the Alabama Department of Archives and History, the Vermont Historical Society, some Jackson County Historical Society in Independence, Missouri. And again, the point was I really didn't want to read more about U.S. Grant. I wanted to read about the little grunt who was at the back of his line. So that's where I looked for him. And what I really wanted were these soldiers to say, I look at the flag and I think of my farm, or I think of my wife or my mother. And they wouldn't cooperate. They wouldn't do what I wanted them to do. And I was really frustrated with them for that reason.
What were you finding? Were you finding a similar theme among both Union and Confederate soldiers?
Two things. I knew there would be Union and Confederate differences. I was less interested in those, although I was interested in those, than in intra-regional differences, East-West and that sort of thing. And I found very little of the East-West difference that I was looking for. There were Midwesterners who thought people from the East were prissy, and Easterners who thought they had bad manners in the West, but you could predict that if you ride the metro today. You could hear that kind of conversation. That was not that surprising. So that was one thing. They weren't talking about what I wanted them to, but they wouldn't stop talking about what they weren't supposed to talk about, and that was slavery. And that was what they were not supposed to care about. Or at least it wasn't supposed to enter the center of their world in the way that it seemed to. So I spent a good long time annoyed with them for not doing what I wanted them to do, until finally, I woke up and realized there's a story here. I didn't think these guys should be talking about slavery, and they are. And so I need to understand why. Why did they care? What difference did it make to somebody from Arkansas or Alabama who had never owned a slave, whether or not slavery survived? What difference did it make to somebody who grew wheat in Illinois or who made shoes in Massachusetts? Why did he care whether something called the Union survived or whether there was slavery in it or not? And once I sort of figured out that was my question, then that became my approach. But again, approach sounds like I knew what I was doing from the outset, and I really didn't. It took me about 2 years of archives, just days in the archives, to figure that out.
So, Professor Manning, as you went through these letters, what were soldiers, let's start with the North. Okay. What were you finding Northern soldiers saying about slavery?
At the beginning, I was struck by the wide range of opinions on slavery. At the beginning, the war really is about Union for most Northern soldiers, not all, but most. And what I mean by that is that most of them enter the war convinced that the United States has to survive. It has to survive to show to the world that representative government can work. These guys were kids in 1848, and a series of revolutions in 1848 in Europe, as they see it, failed. These were failed democratic revolutions, and so as they see the United States, this is it. This is the world's last shot. Self-government works here, or it will never be tried again. So if these states think that they can destroy the government, which is how Union soldiers see it, because they didn't like who got elected, then we have just said self-government doesn't work. So we have to prove that this thing can survive. And that's how they start. But they don't have to be in the South very long before they begin to think, why did we get into this fix to begin with? They talk to white Southerners, they talk to slaves, and they're really struck by how we got into this problem to begin with because of this institution of slavery. And if you want to solve a problem, the only way to do it is to root out the cause. So Union soldiers made a shift much, much earlier than I had anticipated. The big shift begins in the summer of 1861 with soldiers beginning to write home to their families, but also to their elected officials, to say that if we want to win this war, and if we don't want to fight it again in 10 years, we need to get rid of the problem. We need to get rid of slavery, or it's going to be back, we'll be right back at square one. So they at first take a really practical approach to the slavery problem. It's the way to solve a problem. Get rid of the cause, problem goes away. But they stay in the South. It's, this is their sort of first reaction to what they view as the causes of the war. But then, as they stay in the South, more and more they interact with real live slaves, real live people who run to the Union Army by the thousands. And suddenly it's harder to dismiss slaves as an abstraction, or black people as a sort of undefined category, something you've never heard of before. It's harder to think of them that way when you have individuals with names and with stories and with families in your camp. And they also do useful things for you, like your laundry. And so the initial feelings about slavery are sort of quite instrumental. It's a problem, solve it. But extended experience in the South, I think, really humanizes African American people for soldiers, and they begin to take a more reflective look at, there's something wrong with this. It's not just inconvenient, there's something wrong, and it's got to go, because you only win a war when God's on your side, and there's no way God lets you win if you let something like slavery exist. So a sort of practical response in the early months is joined by a kind of moral and even religious reckoning as the war proceeds.
And you're finding that across the board among Northern soldiers?
I really am. Now, there's differences of opinion about everything. You've got 2 million men in Union Blue, but 2 million people, any 2 million people are going to disagree about things, with the one exception of the food is bad. They all agree about that. Other than that, there's divisions of opinion about everything. But what's striking is how weighted the opinion is. Again, not at the outset. There's a big range at the outset, but as the war proceeds. So there are a lot of guys who enter the war. I want nothing to do with slavery. I can think of one in particular. His name is Chauncey Welton. I call him Mouthy Chauncey. I think he's 18 or 19. He's from Ohio. And he enlists, and he and his father and his uncle are quite close, and they're also very active or very enthusiastic in the sort of far wing of the Democratic Party, sometimes called the Copperheads, the wing of the party that is most given to sort of race baiting and most opposed to the notion of emancipation. Well, that's how he enters. And he gets through, he gets about midway through the war, even as late as 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. He's still not sure this emancipation is a good idea, and it's not what he signed up for. He's not going to leave, but he's not happy about it. But again, he stays in the South. He goes through experiences no one at home can even imagine. And he, who's the most rabid anti-abolitionist I've found in the early months, by the end of the war is writing home to his father and his uncle to sort of re-educate them. At one point, he writes to his father and he says, "Well, you think that I have, turned against my country. Well, I think you are mistaken considerable," which is the voice. That's why I call him Mouthy Chauncey. He sort of mouths off to his father. And he proceeds to explain exactly why the war has to take down slavery. And then at the very end of the war, when it ends, how he greets the ending is, Yes, we are free, 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 free from the blighting curse of slavery. Praise to God, we are free. That's a 180-degree turnaround. And so if you look at any moment in the Union ranks, of